Hi there, Matt Webber with you and brought to you by Bond University. This is Sport by Experts. A couple of weeks back I was conducting my daily trawl of the media outlets and newspapers when I was stopped in my tracks by a study undertaken by our national broadcaster, the ABC. The Elite Athletes in Australian Women's Sport Survey asked 152 current or recently retired elite athletes across 47 sports their views on a range of topics, including earnings, discrimination, resourcing, support, health and wellbeing. The results, at least to me, were eye-opening, to say the least. High levels of lived experience with discrimination, online trolling and harassment and the like, significant financial inequity, and also a big chunk experiencing negativity around body image, close to half conceding that they'd experienced disordered eating as an athlete. Of course, Bond University is home to a bastion of incredibly high-achieving female athletes, swimmers, netballers, rugby and AFL players, many, many more. So my interest was particularly piqued. It's the health aspects we'll focus on today, specifically the nutrition part. And to help us, we're joined by someone who operates at the front line of many of the matters in question. Bond-trained dietitian and health scientist, and the brains behind Athlete Sports Nutrition, who I strongly suggest you follow on Instagram because her content is excellent. Myria Cano-Hall. Myria, hi.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Now, you work in this space on the front line, as I've described, active people, active women, seeking the very best performance out of themselves. When you saw the survey results, what was your reaction? Were you surprised? Did you see opportunity? Explain it to me.
Yeah, I guess coming from being in the space, the survey results themselves, they weren't surprising because I see it every day. But the amount of athletes that described experiencing things like irregular menstrual cycles, particularly things like not enough education with coaches in sport, that's, surprising.
Your content and messaging, I've already sung the praises of your Instagram presence.
Thank you.
do find her, do press follow or like or whatever you have to do in this day and age, because I find it really educational. I know my daughters do too. But your content and messaging often challenges fueling norms. In particular, you're big on people being realistic about the amount they have to eat and the things that they have to eat to get the best out of themselves. Oftentimes, according to you, they drastically underestimate what's required.
Yeah.
What are some of the common presentations of athletes, particularly elite athletes or those aspiring to be elite? What do you see day to day?
Yeah. Well, I think with athletes and particularly underestimating the amount that they need, it's so common in elite sports because they just come up so quickly from being young into like that elite section, and with the lack of education in that space, it's so hard for them to really understand how much they need to be eating. Commonly with the athletes that I work with, a lot of the time, the main presentation that I would see is athletes who either, particularly females, who just don't have a menstrual cycle at all, have never had one. We call that hypothalamic amenorrhea. Or that I would have a female athlete come to me who's either got an irregular cycle or completely lost their cycle. It's very, very common in female athletes. Other symptoms that we typically see are things like really poor mood and energy levels, poor digestion, a whole range of things that really play on from this athlete who's just underfueling as like the bottom line.
So it's a multi-symptomatic thing.
Yeah, so we call it low energy availability. So low energy availability is somewhat like an umbrella term. And there's three kinds of energy availability that fall under that. So we've got adaptable LEA, which is common where athletes in weight-making sports might need to drop weight quickly to get to a certain weight for their category. That's typically benign effects. They won't have any rough symptoms or anything there. We then also have problematic LEA, and this is where things start to get a bit dicey when it comes to particularly female athletes and their menstrual cycle, and things can either become irregular or start to go downhill. And then we have REDS. So REDS is something that's definitely coming up more frequently in sports and particularly female athletes with the research, because that's essentially where females will completely lose their menstrual cycle. They will start to have digestive issues. They will start to have irregular hormones, which can then also later impact things like fertility, bone health, muscle mass, training adaptations. It's just a multitude of things that you just don't want to get to.
Yeah, I'm curious about, it's the most ridiculous thing to say in this instance, but what's feeding this particular problem, if you'll excuse the vernacular. If there is information available to people, and there's expert dietetics advice at arm's length, I can't help but think about where people are getting their information from, or who their role models might be, or what's feeding their aspirations in terms of what it is that they think they need to look like in order to be what they want to be.
Yes.
I mean, all these different factors, is this an overlay that I suppose informs some of your practice?
Yeah, I think, like you mentioned, like in terms of where athletes are getting most of their nutrition information from, social media is by far the most common source of nutrition information that athletes and general population are using to access health information, right? And because we have freedom of speech in our country, anybody can go on and say anything, particularly in the nutrition space, when even if they're not necessarily qualified, they're able to share their views and perspectives, which a lot of the time may not be embedded in things like strong research or evidence. And that in itself, like even as a sports dietitian myself, I find the nutrition information space on social media very confusing. And I have that background and that degree. And if I find it confusing, I can't imagine how athletes feel who might not have as much exposure to nutrition or understanding in that space feel. I do feel, even though we know LEA and REDS are bad and have such a plethora of symptoms and negative performance and health outputs, one of the main reasons or common things that I hear athletes say to me in terms of if they know that they're in that situation, they're not ready to address it because they know it means eating more food. And that then falls into why we see so much, particularly in aesthetic-based sports, so things commonly like gymnastics or dances, or even particularly like swimming and things like that, where people almost expect athletes to look a certain way. Athletes are then afraid that if they start eating more, even if they know it's going to benefit their health or performance, it may change their body composition. And that is a massive fear given how much discrimination and stipulation that athletes face on social media regarding how they look when they're comp ready.
We'll talk about what answers may be to this myriad problems in a little while. Let's drill down though into some of the data in the survey. As I mentioned before, the Elite Athletes in Australian Women's Sports Survey, 152 current or recently retired elite athletes. You're a health scientist. That's a good solid sample.
It's a solid sample.
47 different sports. The body image statistics were particularly compelling to me. Now, 30% have neutral feelings about how it is that they look. 27% have negative or extremely negative feelings about how they present in a mirror, or whether they match the expectations of others or their coaches or those invested in their performance. And we'll talk about the 44% who've experienced an eating disorder in a tick. But I mean, it strikes me as so contrary that 30% of elite athletes might sort of look at themselves and go, meh. If you add that to, like, I think in that context, neutral is probably fairly negative. 27% on top of 57% of elite athletes, less than satisfied with what it is that they're seeing after all that work and all that effort. Your thoughts and reflections on that?
It's crazy. That part of the survey probably shines the biggest amount of light on a lot of the issues that are still in elite sports today, particularly female sports, with things like body image and how we expect our female athletes to show up in the elite space. I think it definitely needs to change.
Yeah.
It's so sad to hear that over 50% of our best female athletes are dissatisfied with what they see in the mirror. And like you said, they put in so much hard work and so much effort, and if anything, so many people probably look up to them to be like, wow, they're like the top of their game, body composition on point, and yet to hear that they themselves are not happy with what they see, it's just heartbreaking.
I dwell in a couple of instances of female AFL players, and I won't name them, but their experience on social media versus that of their male counterparts. So you might see a rather healthily proportioned front row forward for Bond University rugby, you know, affectionately referred to as, you know, he's a big bopper, or, you know, he's a big chunk, a big lump of a lad. A female counterpart playing in the same role in the same sport, in the female version thereof, will often be the subject of derision or snide, snarky commentary. We've seen it across a number of sports, particularly in the context of larger forward goal-kicking athletes in AFL whose physique is a tremendous advantage for any AFL team. But to think that they're participating in circumstances where they're just bombarded with vitriol on top of how it is that perhaps they're perceiving themselves, it's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. And one thing I always say to any athlete that I work with, and one thing that I just wish more people knew, was that at the end of the day, you're never going to look like an athlete. I feel like people have like a really weird idea of what an athlete is meant to look like. But at the end of the day, because of how many different sports there are, how many different key positions they are, particularly when you're looking at team sports, you could look at a rugby team or an AFL team, and not all the players are going to look the same. They're going to be built, or they're going to have the body that's built for their position, and that's going to give them the most advantage in their position. Same with any other sport. Like, you wouldn't expect a weightlifter to look the same as an elite marathon runner, because they're not going to perform the same. And yet there's this weird conception across sports where if an athlete doesn't look a certain way of how people perceive or think an athlete should look, then they mustn't be healthy, or they mustn't be fit, or they mustn't be suited or good at their sport. It's a very weird thing when it comes to body image, and particularly in the female space, where they're like, oh, you know, a female rugby player who might be a little bit more stocky, strong, carrying a lot of muscle mass, certainly is not going to be the leanest athlete on the field, but maybe the strongest.
Yeah. When athletes present to you and you pick up cues that may indicate to you that that the athlete is struggling with some of these external pressures that we're discussing, how do you manage that as a dietitian?
Yeah, I mean, it's so common, like in terms of like working in the athlete space, and particularly I've noticed that the higher level an athlete competes at, the more likely they're going to be dissatisfied with how they look, because of the pressures that come with that higher level sport, and that demand to really just hone in on all the little 1%ers. But one of the biggest things, and particularly for me in my space, being aware of like obviously my scope in that space, like I'm not a psychologist, and I feel like particularly with body image and mindset, a lot of that is best paired when you're working with a dietitian as well as a psychologist or a counsellor or somebody who can support more of the mindset change in that space. And then, because at the end of the day, like working with an athlete and a female athlete, it's not just the dietitian, it's a whole team effort. It's the coach, it's the sports psych, it's all of us. And whenever I have an athlete come to me who is struggling with things like that, obviously my first goal is to, okay, let's shift this mindset away from aesthetics-based focus or eating for aesthetics to look a certain way, and let's focus on, okay, what goals does this athlete want to achieve? Do they want to get stronger in the gym? Do they want to build muscle mass? Do they want to be faster, fitter, recover better? All those things are what proper fueling and enough food are what going to help with at the end of the day.
So a confidence born of performance and ticking off goals rather than the aesthetic elements that you...
And almost sometimes even just educating athletes at that high level that they're not like normal people. They are not a normal person with the amount of training that they do and the amount of effort that they put in. they are superhuman in the sense that they shouldn't be eating like everybody else around them because they're not doing things like everyone else around them. They need to be eating more and eating in aligned with how much energy they're burning at the end of the day with their training.
Yeah. So the quantification part of it all is important. For an elite level athlete, I know there's power athletes and there's endurance athletes, and it's how long's a piece of string with this kind of thing. Is there a sort of a general rule of thumb for a particularly active athletic person as to how much fuel they should be chucking into themselves every day?
Oh, it varies so significantly, and I guess this is where the role of sports dietitians is so unique and cool in the sense that we individualise everything to an athlete. So we have our set guidelines of, what range roughly should an athlete be eating in terms of protein, carbs, fats, and then we kind of fill in the blanks with like your micronutrients, fruits, veggies, all that kind of stuff. In terms of roughly how much an athlete would need, it's like what you said, how long is a piece of string? It's so hard to say because at the end of the day, there is no one set number. It's, fueling will change depending on how many sessions an athlete has that day. What kind of session are they doing? Is it a harder, intense session or is it like a light skills-based session? It'll vary based around competition or race weeks, or there's so much variation in that it's why I feel like more athletes need access to better fueling strategies through a dietitian or a sports dietitian.
Yeah. It seems like a forgotten art in some way, shape or form. The 44% of elite athletes of those surveyed have experienced an eating disorder or disordered eating. They're different things, aren't they?
They are.
Perhaps you can delineate between the two and then we can expand.
Yes, so an eating disorder is something that's classified using what's called a DSM-5, and essentially it's things that are listed in this manual type thing that, people have to meet a certain criteria to then be diagnosed with a certain eating disorder. Whereas disordered eating doesn't necessarily meet the criterion of a full eating disorder, but it can express itself in behaviours such as, restrictive eating, for example, or having very strong food fears around things. Carbs seems to be the most common one. They get a pretty bad rap. Everyone's afraid of carbs. So restricting carbs in an effort to then lose weight or try and manipulate body composition. So it's not necessarily as serious as what an eating disorder is. An eating disorder, when diagnosed and all the criterion is met, is quite a serious thing, whereas disordered eating still is quite serious but isn't enough to meet the criterion.
The idea you mentioned, carbs seem to be taboo at the moment, just as protein seems to be the hot topic. Protein powder, protein. Eat your steak, do the protein. Everyone's going protein crazy. It's a conversation in my own family that is far too.
I feel like every single cereal brand has come out with some form of high protein version of their cereal.
High protein matcha. You name it, there's extra protein in it. As a dietitian, are these sorts of fluctuations welcome, or are they troubling?
I wouldn't say that they're troubling. I definitely feel like when we look at things, particularly from like a food marketing perspective, I feel like if somebody is able to slap protein or high protein on a product, it's going to sell better because everybody wants to get their protein in. Everyone knows protein is important. And in Australia, in order for a product to actually be called high protein, it has to have at least a minimum of 10 grams of protein per serve. So if they can put things in there to boost it up to get it over, then they can slap on the high protein label.
Right, trickery. Yes, yeah.
But I definitely wouldn't say it's troubling. I guess for some athletes who do struggle to hit their protein intake, particularly when they have a very high protein intake, if they're not wanting to use protein powders or if that's not an option, sometimes using more protein fortified foods can be helpful. But when we actually look at the amount of protein per serve in, like, for example, like a protein-based cereal, it's not huge. Like compared to like the standard serving size of a regular cereal, it'd be like 5 extra grams. So in the grand scheme of things, you're paying more for like 5 extra grams of protein, and it's not really worth it.
So why are carbs on the nose?
I feel like because carbs, there's so much debate in terms of like the different diets and things like that that don't include carbs, and then people are like, oh, but people get really good results on things like keto or carnivore, and you know, those kinds of diets don't have any form of carbohydrates in them. Certainly would never recommend them for an athlete. But people then always attribute fat gain or fluctuations in weight to carbs, and in a way they are right, because when we do eat more carbs we get what's called glycogen, which comes from glucose, excess glucose that gets stored in our muscles. And with every molecule of glycogen that we store, we also store 3 molecules of water. So typically when you eat more carbs, you'll have more glycogen in your muscles and also a little bit more water weight, which is where the fluctuations on the scale tend to come into play. Okay. So when people start eating more carbs, the weight scales will likely go up, not from fat gain, but from water and glycogen. And same when they start to cut carbs, that's why people tend to see such a rapid drop in weight, because they're eliminating their glycogen stores and water. So
the science of dietetics, there you go. Now we don't need a degree. If we can go back to our 44% though, of elite athletes that have experienced an eating disorder or disordered eating.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with how that coexists with performance. You know, is there a period of time with which you can carry one of these disorders or disordered eating type conditions and get away with it before performance drops away drastically? How does that sort of relationship work?
You are correct in saying that athletes, particularly who, if they have an eating disorder, or more so commonly with disordered eating, because disordered eating is very commonly linked with underfueling and the low energy availability and the REDs of what I was talking about before. Commonly, like, athletes can get away with it for a certain period of time, but things will start to slowly creep in, and then, you know, we see things like feeling like more little niggles in your body, or being injured more frequently, or being sick all the time, or not recovering well. Those kinds of symptoms start to become more and more apparent until, and again, I say this to my athletes all the time, you can go a certain distance, but at some point your body, like an engine, is just going to blow up.
Yeah, it'll put the brakes on.
It'll put, if you don't stop, your body will almost force you to stop.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing we see with this in female athletes in particular, when they do lose their cycle or have an irregular cycle, is massive impacts to their bone health, because hormones like estrogen and progesterone, which are really important in a female cycle, when they lose their period, essentially their hormones are the same as a postmenopausal woman.
Wow.
So even if a female athlete's 16, completely lost her period, her hormone status would be the complete same as a postmenopausal woman.
You know, I grew up with daughters, been surrounded by elite netballers for a long time in my family and extended relationships, and it's almost a common given among a lot of young, high-achieving elite athletes.
Yes.
I haven't had a period for years.
Yeah.
And that's a nutrition-based issue.
There are things aside from nutrition, health-wise, that can contribute to irregular cycles, but most commonly what I see in athletes, and particularly athletes training quite a lot, is predominantly underfueling.
Yeah, wow.
The underlying factor here.
Yeah.
And particularly I find in a lot of sports and a lot of high-level sports these days, particularly with coaches and coaches who coach female athletes, if an athlete loses their cycle, it's common for the coach to almost see that as they're working hard enough, or they're doing the work and they're dedicated. And it's like, there's still an odd normalization around it when it's like, that should not be. And it's definitely gotten a lot better. But I do feel that with that lack of education in the coaching support team around things like nutrition and fueling and female health and menstrual cycles, it still kind of seeps through the gaps.
Yeah. Just to dwell on some of the numbers that have come out of the survey, 75% have experienced menstrual irregularities as an elite athlete.
Yeah.
As you've just touched on, 75%, the same number say their cycles aren't taken into consideration. in and around the training schedules that they undertake, and the list goes on. Just before we move on, I wanted to touch on the physiological and biological factors here.
Yeah.
You touched on bone health.
Yes.
So a prolonged period with a disrupted or absent cycle, what potentially could happen to a female's physiology if that's ongoing?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, important hormones like progesterone and estrogen, they drop, or they essentially, the body stops producing them. And estrogen plays an important role in maintaining bone health and bone rebuilding. So when an athlete loses their cycle, essentially their bone health becomes compromised because they're having a faster breakdown of bone than they are remodeling or building back up, which is common particularly in athletes who are doing quite a lot of strenuous high-intensity exercise that's causing bone breakdown, but they don't have the hormones to be able to essentially build that back up. So things like stress fractures or broken bones are very, very common in athletes suffering from LEA and REDS.
Are there any other elements? Fertility down the line?
Yeah, so obviously ovulation is significantly impacted as well, because obviously if you lose your cycle, you stop ovulating. So some athletes can then later regain their cycle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will regain a healthy ovulation. So that's a completely other can of worms.
Yeah, wow.
But that in itself can then impact things like fertility later on down the track. In terms of things like even like thyroid health and just natural like hormone production gets down-regulated. So when that gets down-regulated, even things like metabolism slow down, and then athletes do find it harder to maintain things like muscle mass or body composition. So obviously then that adds an extra layer of detriment to obviously their sporting performance if they're not able to maintain a body composition that's going to support their performance in their sport. Digestion also slows down. So a lot of the time with athletes who experience LEA or REDS, a lot of the time they'll come to me and say, I'm intolerant to gluten and I have a lactose intolerance because I can't stomach it. And a lot of the time it's because when your body everything's down-regulated, so your body is essentially in low power mode. Kind of like when your iPad or iPhone is running on like 20% battery, your body switches into the same mode. So it's still running and everything is still working, but everything in the background, all the background apps are running a lot slower to try and conserve energy.
The gears are grinding.
So the gears are grinding. So obviously things like your digestion slow down, so then you have food that sits in your stomach for longer, which can cause things like bloating, gas, discomfort, which a lot of people then attribute to things like, oh, it's the gluten or oh, it's the dairy. No, it could just be that you're under fueling and that your digestion has slowed down.
Yeah, wow. There's so much to contemplate with all of this. Should we talk about contraception too? Because this is a significant piece of the puzzle as well, in terms of female athletes wanting to regulate themselves and make life a bit easier on in their training schedule, everything fit more neatly. But there are impacts here too that concern you.
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon for me to work with an athlete who's on contraception, more so to help, like you said, kind of manage their cycle around competition and training. But the issue that I have with it is sometimes when you can clearly see that an athlete is under fueling, you essentially cannot technically diagnose REDS or LEA if an athlete's on contraception because they don't have a cycle naturally. And the main kind of symptom that we use to diagnose LEA and REDS, or one of the most common ones, is their hormone health in their blood work. But when they're on the pill, that's almost kind of a bit skewed.
And just for context here, we're talking about of those surveyed, these elite 150 odd elite athletes, 40% have used the pill, about 20% have used an IUD, and a relatively minor proportion, 36% haven't used any hormonal contraception at all. So we're talking about a significant chunk of this population.
It can make, obviously then, diagnosing things like LEA and REDS really hard, because it essentially masks any kind of symptoms that we would usually see if they did have a regular cycle. In some instances though, because the pill is synthetic hormones, it can act to protect bone health in those situations. But again, I always see it as just kind of a band-aid fix for a lot of female athletes when it comes more so to treating LEA and REDS. But yeah, it's not uncommon for female athletes, obviously given the survey results, to be on contraception. It can just make monitoring their fueling a little bit harder, because we kind of eliminate an entire hormonal element that is so important in making sure the athlete is healthy on the inside.
The other thing we wanted to talk about today, Myra, was this significant proportion of the athletes surveyed who described an absence of help or an absence of understanding. This is complex,
it's
intricate stuff. It's very individualised. It requires a genuine deep dive.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It's very hard to kind of condense everything down.
But you know, case by case, you would be. I can, you know, the data and the, you know, a bit of column A and a bit of column B to make everything work. But you know, 53% saying. Only 53% saying they were offered access to medical treatment and or financial support while recovering from injury. It sort of speaks to a lack of understanding of what's required for a female athlete, well, any athlete really, but a female athlete in particular. But in and around this nutrition piece, what's the answer? Like, what do you advocate?
One of the biggest things that I hear a lot of athletes say to me is, obviously athletes don't earn a lot of money, and money in terms of the cost of living crisis, it's a massive piece. And seeing a dietitian or sports dietitian, it's not cheap, it's expensive. And I know particularly at elite level, like they do have in-house dietitians, but I do know that in-house dietitians are only able to service certain athletes depending on what level they're competing at. So I think any athlete who wants to perform at a higher level or is aiming to essentially make, say, the Olympics, for example, I think can definitely benefit from working with a dietitian in terms of making that more accessible. I guess it's what I've tried to do in my own little business model, and try and make, you know, that kind of very like close one-on-one contact and high-level support more accessible for athletes to be able to access without that financial barrier. So I offer things like athlete sponsorships and things like that, where it does allow athletes to come on board and receive like nutrition support and education around their sport that's individualised at a much lesser cost.
Yeah, right. As a starting point, for perhaps as someone who can't afford a dietitian or is unwilling to take that step, I'm sort of reading between the lines here too, you're essentially saying just be mindful of how big your tank is.
Pretty much. Understand like how big your fuel tank is, and I think in terms of watch it, and obviously follow, like, given social media is so accessible, follow people who know what they're talking about, who have the accreditations, who have the education and the understanding, who are even like people who are talking specifically about your sport. Like, get your information from as credible sources as you can on social media. And yes, like you said, and put so gracefully, be mindful of your tank and how much you actually need to put in it.
It's probably more than you think.
Yeah.
Myra, you're doing a bit of teaching here at Bond University, so you've returned to your old school.
I have. I can't get away.
Like I said, you studied health science and did your Master of Dietetics here.
Yes.
So teaching, and you're loving that. The rest of the time you're devoting to your business at Elite Nutrition.
Yep.
Look it up online, please. Look at the Instagram feed; it is excellent. So, a hotbed of information. What are your ambitions, your goals in this space, longer term?
Longer term, I've always, like, my goal and passion has always set out to obviously help as many athletes as I can, just because I know how rampant things like LEA and REDS are, particularly in female athletes. Longer term with my business, I'd love to expand into more of the motorsport and motocross scene. I really enjoy that scene.
You're a keen dirt biker, aren't you?
Keen dirt biker. I grew up on it. I love it. It's a massive passion of mine. And again, it's a space or an area of nutrition that has no nutrition support at all in there. So I thought, well, time to step up.
And you just picked up a client, I think, in that space. Tell us about her.
Yeah, so she is a desert racer. She's racing in the Fink Desert Race this year. It's the 50th anniversary. It's a massive, grueling desert race in the Northern Territory across the Fink. I'm very excited to be supporting her during that time. And then I'm also working with a few other pro riders who are going to go into the MXGP racing later this year.
Right. So, out of interest's sake, an endurance dirt bike enthusiast, what is their intake? What do they need to fuel? What's going on physiologically for them?
The biggest thing that I focus on with a lot of my riders is obviously hydration, particularly when they're racing in the desert or heat, like very hot conditions, when we're taking into account obviously the heat from the bike plus the heat from the gear and environmental factors. But they still need things like carbs and protein and fats. They might just not need as much in terms of carbs as, say, like a CrossFit athlete or a swimmer. But definitely still need to be fueling the training on the bike as well as off the bike.
You've got your old niche, your niche sport lined up and ready to go.
Doing my best.
Absolute delight to chat to you again.
Thank you for
we met
having me.
last year when you graduated
Yep.
with your masters. So great to see that you're putting all that hard work into something so brilliantly beneficial for so many people.
Thank you.
I hope we get to chat again
Yes.
another time soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Myra.